Here we go. So as folks are coming in, I will do my little welcome spiel. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Constance McBaron. I'm the Communications and Engagement Lead at EarthLab. And I want to give a quick but heartfelt thank you to my colleagues, Ali Long from EarthLab and Athena Bertolino from Future Rivers for supporting this event. So we are all joining this event today from across the United States, where numerous tribal communities have lived since time immemorial. And I acknowledge the Coast Salish people of the land that I am on today, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. While it's important to acknowledge the land that we're on, it's imperative that we follow up that acknowledgement with action. And so I encourage you to learn more about the actions you can take to support the tribal nations in your area. Today, we are all here to learn from and connect with Leah Thomas, aka Green Girl Leah, aka the author of the Intersectional Environmentalist. Leah will share with us a quick excerpt from her book and then take audience questions. But first, I would like to share a short bio about Leah as our official introduction. So Leah Thomas is an eco-communicator, aka an environmentalist with a love for writing and creativity, based in Ventura, California. She's passionate about advocating for and exploring the relationship between social justice and environmentalism. You could say she's trying to make the world a little more equal for everyone and a little nicer to our home planet. She's the founder of eco lifestyle blog at Green Girl Leah, which you can find on Instagram, where I follow her personally, and the Intersectional Environmentalist platform, which is a resource and media hub that aims to advocate for environmental justice and inclusivity within environmental education movements. Her articles on this topic have appeared in Vogue and Elle, and she's been featured in publications such as Harper's Bazaar and W Magazine, as well as numerous podcasts. She has a BS in Environmental Science and Policy from Chapman University and worked for the National Park Service and Patagonia headquarters before pursuing environmentalism full-time. So with that, we officially welcome you, Leah, to UW. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I guess to kick it off, I'll do a brief reading from my book. I'm going to be reading the first page of the introduction and also the last page of the book, which I feel like is really fun. And I hope you enjoy. So I wrote this book because, and also hopefully with the blur filter, you can still see the book. But I wrote this book because I believe that we can't save the planet without uplifting the voices of its people, especially those most often unheard. And we should care about the protection of people as much as we care about the protection of our planet, because to me, these fights are the same. And as a society, we often forget that humans are a part of our global ecosystem and that we don't exist separately from nature. We coexist with it each and every day. And unfortunately, as with other animals, some humans are endangered and facing a multitude of social and environmental injustices that impact their ability to not only survive, but also thrive in liberation and joy. Why then are conservation efforts not extended to the protection of endangered humans and their human rights? This is a question I've struggled with as a Black environmentalist for years, because in my environmental practice, caring for the earth means caring for its people. And the book, which we'll talk about a little bit in our discussion, is kind of broken out into different tenets of a pledge, which is called the Intersectional Environmentalist Pledge. So I'm going to read for you all the final tenet of that pledge and the final 2 pages of the book, if you promise that you'll go read the rest of the book, because the context is really important too. So the last tenet of the pledge is, I will amplify the messages of Black, Indigenous, and POC activists and environmental leaders, and I will not remain silent during pivotal political and cultural moments that impact Black, Indigenous, and POC communities and all marginalized identities. And this tenet of the pledge is one of the most important because it's twofold. It encourages you to, 1, amplify the messages of diverse climate leaders and activists, and 2, not remain silent. Silence is what allows the status quo to continue, and together all of our voices are so powerful, much more powerful than we might think. Take it from me, I truly didn't think that one post on social media, one small moment of resistance, would catapult intersectional environmentalism into existence and allow me to dedicate my life to environmental education, which we'll talk about during our chat. Amplification is important because it leads to a ripple effect of awareness that can shift into action and change the world. Sometimes people downplay the importance of raising awareness, but amplification is one of the easiest and most powerful ways to draw attention to narratives and causes that need visibility. Every leader is just a person, just like you, and leaders were individuals who were listened to one person at a time until a community and the momentum of grassroots activism allowed their voices to be elevated. My unique experiences in activism and digital media have made me realize just how powerful our individual actions are and how they can lead to systemic change. Because each of us is a part of a global ecosystem, and we have the potential to make a greener, safer, and more equitable future for everyone through what we choose to amplify and put action behind. Activism is for everyone, and don't let anyone make you doubt yourself, because we can all play a role no matter how big or small. So my call to action is that you think about your special skills and apply them to the movements that you care about. Even though I'm anxious and don't always feel comfortable holding a megaphone, which is interesting because that's my job now, I have found that writing and digital media are ways for me to contribute my unique skills to environmentalism. And while your activism might not look like mine or the next person's, all of our strengths are pieces of the puzzle. A mentor of mine once said, "Even the revolution needs accountants." This made me laugh, but it's true. We can each contribute our skills in some way. So I'll leave you with this. I hope that you understand just how powerful you are, and please do share and amplify the messages you believe the world needs to hear. Take a leap of faith and attend a local protest if you can. Raise your hand to introduce an intersectional perspective where it needs to be heard. Stand up for what's right and don't back down, even when it's difficult. And even when you might feel alone, trust me, we're out there. There are generations of intersectional environmentalists in the field that are ready to embrace you with support. Together, we can transform the future of environmentalism, and with collective action, spread our message across the globe and change enough hearts and minds to positively alter the future. The future is intersectional. So that was the last page of the book and also the first page of the book. And I'm excited to jump into our facilitated discussion and Q&A to kind of fill in some of those gaps.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah. Yes, so we are opening Q&A now. If you have any questions for Leah, please put them in the chat at any time. We did get a few questions through the RSVP process, so we'll start with those. And one question I think is a great way to start off. So this student asked, is there a particular person, group of people, or organization that inspired you to connect systems of oppression and protect people in our world? It is rare for people to make this connection, so I'm hoping I'll learn enough to share your knowledge with those around me.
I would say there's two people that I highlight in the book, and they're nicknamed the mother and father of environmental justice. So first is Hazel M. Johnson, who was from Chicago, and she was a Black woman and one of the first people to identify that an increased amount of African Americans in the United States lived in what she called toxic donuts. So areas that were surrounded by landfills, toxic waste sites, poor air quality, etc. And then after some of her discoveries specific to her neighborhood in Chicago, Dr. Robert Bullard, who is the father of environmental justice, did a lot of data collection to kind of prove that hunch even further. And the data that they found was really startling. Like 3/5 of African Americans lived close to toxic waste sites and facilities. And unfortunately, even though a lot of environmental legislation was passed in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of it wasn't being equally enforced in low income and Black and brown neighborhoods around the country. So I really look up to them and the people who created the environmental justice movement starting in the 80s, because they've been trying to raise awareness that the same communities that are impacted by social injustice are oftentimes also impacted by environmental injustice.
Thank you. I've heard of Dr. Buller, but I hadn't heard of Hazel before, so I'm gonna look her up. Okay, another question we got from the RSVP process is, and this is pretty broad. So what are some of the biggest challenges and opportunities you've seen within the intersectional environmentalism space?
I think that right now so it was what some of the difficulties.
Yeah, challenges and opportunities.
I would say some challenges would be the lack of funding and resources that are available specifically for climate justice and environmental justice, etc. There's a study that the Solutions Project, which is a really incredible organization, put out, and they found that less than 2% of philanthropic funding in the environmental space goes specifically to Black-led climate justice organizations, and less than 5% of all of that funding goes specifically to environmental organizations that are looking at this intersection. So that lack of funding, and the reverse, just for context, goes to, a lot of it goes to Big Green, over about 70% of it. So those are organizations that have been around for a very long time, like the Sierra Club, WWF, etc. PETA is up there, and they're receiving more than $200 million per year for their US chapters alone. And then we're seeing environmental justice organizations, most of them are operating with budgets that are under $100,000 per year. So that funding disparity is a really big concern because they can't really raise awareness for what they're doing as much, and they can't put as many resources towards, fighting for air quality, water quality, etc. So something that I really do like is there are organizations like the Sierra Club that are aware of this disconnect, and people within their organizations are trying to practice wealth redistribution as they're reimagining their own missions and channeling some of their funds to support these environmental justice organizations until the disparity isn't as great. So that's an obstacle. And I also think another really big one is just environmental curriculums around the world and the country. I'm working on a curriculum audit right now, probably starting with public universities because it's a lot easier to look at their curriculums. But the hunch is that the majority of environmental science and studies and sustainability programs in the United States, it's not mandatory to take an environmental justice class. So we're going to go in and improve that. We've looked at a lot of universities, and that's the truth, and that's the case, unfortunately. So if people aren't learning about environmental justice, or if it's just, one chapter in a textbook that they're reading, then we have thousands and thousands of people graduating from sometimes even prestigious universities not prioritizing environmental justice because they might think, oh, I don't have to, it's not a part of my major. So we're trying to push for that to be something that is mandatory to learn about, because I think that would really help when it comes to addressing environmental injustice.
That's really interesting. So would that be for every student, or just students within the College of the Environment, or how are you looking at that?
I would start specifically with environmental science or environmental studies programs. And then from there, hopefully reshaping other curriculums. But I want to start especially with people who are formally studying environmental science. I don't really think there's a lot of grounds to not include environmental justice education. I've talked to a lot of students that have created their own projects that focus on environmental justice. But I think if we want it to be urgent, and it is urgent to address, people need clean air, clean water, etc., then it needs to be talked about. So the people who are graduating from these programs know that it's a career or a field of study they can go into, or regardless of the field that they go into, that in the back of their heads, they're also thinking about that people and planet connection.
Absolutely. I mean, just like we learn reading and math and history, like this is something that everyone should know about.
Mhm.
That's great. So we did get a question I got directly in the chat. Thank you. So what is the first step we all should or could take to move this work forward? And then I have a follow-up question, but we'll start with that.
Yeah, I love stories and I love history. So I think the first part is what I said earlier, getting familiar with some of those people like Hazel M. Johnson. I recently wrote an article for Vogue that was one of my favorites that I've ever written. And it's called All of My Environmental Heroes Are Black Women. And I talk about 5 women that are so cool, like Betty Reed Soskin, who just retired. She's a 100-year-old Black woman park ranger who became a park ranger at 85. I also talked about Hazel M. Johnson, the mother of environmental justice. I talked about Ray Wynn Grant, who's a black bear ecologist, etc. And I think one of the best things that we can do is learn and share their stories with other people, especially a lot of the happy and joyful ones, because just shifting the narrative of what environmentalism looks like will do a lot in the long run. And then secondly, if people want to get involved, I would say start local. Federal policy sometimes feels very scary. So I would say start locally and look up climate justice or environmental justice organizations in your community. Even though I've been in this space for a little while, when I had moved to Ventura, I had looked up climate justice organizations over here, and I found out that they were trying to build an energy plant less than 50 feet away from an elementary school that had a primarily Latinx and Mexican population. So that was really scary, and I didn't even know that was happening very, very close by to my home. But I was alerted because I was following these climate justice organizations on social media and ended up going to a protest and just learning about what was going on. So environmental justice issues vary from county to county. Sometimes it looks like food insecurity, sometimes it looks like air quality, sometimes it looks like, landfills, etc. But just getting really familiar with what's going on in your area and how you can help.
That's great. I think that really segues nicely into the next question. So most people have friends, family, or community members that are likely unaware of the necessity for intersectional approaches to the systems we live in. And sometimes I struggle to engage these people in conversations without defensiveness or judgment. I can commiserate with this person. When you've engaged in conversations with people who are unfamiliar with intersectional environmentalism, do you have specific stories or illustrations that you lean on as an accessible starting point moving forward?
I would transparently say, like, if this person is talking about how they can communicate with people who are non-people of color, because I think sometimes that can be hard, is understanding that intersectional environmentalism is about compounding factors. Race is just one of many, and income is also a really large determining factor of who is experiencing environmental injustice. So sometimes with people who might have a lot of defensiveness specifically about racial justice, I'll talk about economic inequality, because there are so many lower income white communities in the United States that have fracking fluid in their water, or are in a town that had a previous industry that is now polluting their air and water, etc. So sometimes that is a good segue to show people, hey, this is happening to a lot of people. And these things are compounding factors, race and income, etc. But there's so many towns, especially mountain communities in the United States, that are being plagued with environmental injustice. Or just starting locally, just letting people know what's going on in their own communities. Like, oh, did you know? Most people, if you ask them, like, what's the air quality today? They have no idea. And I found it odd because I just thought growing up in the area that I was in that it was normal for most of my family members to have asthma, but it wasn't until later that I realized, our county frequently violates federal air quality standards, like things like that. So I know a lot of this might be kind of alarmist, so I would say balance it as well. But I think sometimes it's good to show people how it's affecting them. and then they're more prone to care. But there will be some defensiveness, and I would just encourage you to meet people where they're at and use language that they might be familiar with. I talked to a church. It's been about a year or so since I talked to a church that was pretty conservative leaning. Also, I see my mom here, which is really funny.
Hi, Mom.
Yeah. I don't know how she found the link.
That's so cute.
Yeah, so I talked to a church about a year ago, even though I'm not particularly religious, but there were people who just really wanted to talk about the protection of the planet, and I'm not here to ask any questions. And just like Dolly Parton, she just released a statement that she thought that the earth was one of God's creations, so we should care for the people and the planet. I thought that was so cool because she was reaching a very specific demographic of people. So meet people where they're at, tap into their interests, etc.
Love that. What would Dolly do? Sometimes you just have yourself, right?
WWDD. Yeah, what would Dolly do?
Exactly right. Great. So thank you, Nicholas, for your question. Next question. So hi, Leah. Thank you so much for your work, voice, and for coming to speak with us. With regard to communication, how do you approach pitching to or speaking with academics or funders of research who are well-intentioned but don't center environmental justice?
Ooh, this is a tough one. It's a really, really difficult one. And thankfully things are changing, but showing people the data and the numbers, that's something that people can't really deny. So kind of talking about the facts of the disparities in funding and how much of it is specifically going to conservation work, et cetera, and showing people the real world impacts of not funding environmental justice-based work and how that's we're getting an increase of respiratory illnesses. There are people who are drinking lead in their water, et cetera. So showing people the real urgency of what's going on, but it can be really difficult. And I would say having numbers to back it up is really important. It's frustrating at times, but we're in the science space. So in this book, for example, there's a chapter, I believe chapter 4, where it's just data about how environmental injustice is impacting different communities and sharing this data with people. And then also sometimes positioning it as something as like, oh, this is a new movement that's happening within the environmental space. Did you know that the Sierra Club is reshaping their mission to prioritize these things, et cetera? And just showing them that this is kind of the direction that the environmental movement is moving in. But I want to affirm that it can be very difficult at times, but there are more and more people that are getting on board. So I'm hopeful.
Definitely. And I think also just what I've learned from working in academia just for a few years, the students that are really passionate about this, they want to learn about this, and that is how dollars go to programs, right? And so, following the students' passion is going to help with that too.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, it can happen pretty quickly. So the summer of 2020 is when I started talking about intersectional environmentalism. And I had mentioned that there was no environmental justice class at my university. And there happened to be a group of students that I didn't really know at the time at my small university that just got together and basically told the department head, like, we want an environmental justice class. This is something that is becoming necessary as a part of environmental education. We're spending all this money on this degree, et cetera. And they listened, and they got a class added in the spring. And it's taught by an Indigenous professor, which I think is so beautiful. So the students want this. And I always get really excited when there are students who share resources from Intersectional Environmentalist and other digital media platforms. We have a student-led documentary because we had a bunch of students that said, we want some sort of educational video that other educators can use in their classrooms. So yeah, I think academics should hopefully get on board because it sounds like it's what the kids want.
Well, James has a really great follow-up question here in the chat about EJ requirements for beginners and students. So he's wondering if you think that there should be a component where they actively engage with local communities, or is it more important that students learn the basics and then listen and learn before trying to go out in the world to create change?
I think you can have a little bit of both at the same time. And I guess it depends on the ages of the students, but I think it is really important to understand what's happening in their local community. And data visualizations help with this so much. It can even just be one class where you're looking at something like tree equity. American Forest has amazing studies about median income and tree coverage, and then you can kind of talk about how the lack of tree coverage leads to increase of heat stroke and lack of carbon sequestration and air quality, those sorts of things. So maybe having something like that, and then also having something where maybe people are planting trees or some sort of initiative, or working with a tree equity organization that is specifically trying to get trees, not just anywhere, but in the areas that need them. So I think when you're talking about environmental justice, it's really important to have a balance where you're not specifically only talking about the trauma of the environmental injustice, but you're always pairing it with a solution and the solutions that are available. And sometimes getting out there and getting active, connecting them to a local organization can really do that. Because I just want to make sure that people know that intersectional environmentalism, again, it's not just about the trauma of what's happening to people. You need to understand that. But the fun part is kind of reimagining what environmental education can look like. So make sure you're also sharing the stories, like really unique stories about the disability justice movement and the intersections of environmentalism and who some of the leaders are. Talk about queer ecology and things like that. There's so many stories that need to be shared that are really inclusive and are also really fun. So make sure to include those things too.
Great, thank you. We did get another question in the chat from Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. Something that sticks with me about historical organizations associated with conservation, like the Sierra Club and our park system, have a pretty racist and colonial history. Can you talk to us about your relationship to this historical legacy?
Yeah, so I was a park ranger intern, but very specifically. So I went to a park called Nicodemus. That was my first placement in college. And it is a town that after slavery, freed African Americans went to west of the Mississippi to start their own town. They had nothing. They built dugouts in the ground to live at. And they also built one of the first post offices, the first churches, etc. And it was just this thriving Black town. And the descendants wanted to preserve that site, and it became a National Historic Site. So it was really great for me as a Black woman to be in that space, even if it wasn't, specifically with the National Park Service system, but to really recognize that my history is a part of this history. And there are a lot of other cultural sites within the National Park Service system because people of color, Indigenous and Black and Brown people are saying our history is also environmental history, and we're going to reclaim what environmentalism looks like. With the Sierra Club, for example, I think that they so far are a really good case study of reckoning with that racist past. In 2020 or 2021, they released an article talking about all of these things, talking about the racist history and the nuance of John Muir, or even just outdoor exploration, and how so much of that was taking land from Indigenous peoples, etc. And I thought that that was so important, and so many other environmental organizations should do that. They should be accountable for the past, and it doesn't mean that their organizations need to cease to exist, but it's telling the true intersectional history of environmentalism and the true story of their organizations and paving a new future. So what organizations like the Sierra Club can do is practice wealth redistribution, update their missions, etc. But the wealth redistribution part is one of the most important. So helping to, because they already have a robust donor base, so helping to channel some of those funds into grassroots climate justice organizations, amplifying their messages, amplifying the messages of different diverse activists with their huge platforms, so these other organizations and initiatives can continue to grow. But yeah, it can be really difficult. But I think there are a lot of people of color who are trying to reclaim their space within environmental history. And part of that sometimes looks like declaring something a cultural site or something like that, or a historic site within the National Park Service system or the state park system, etc. But there's a lot of nuance, and I'm really glad Catherine brought this up. And I'd recommend reading that article if you haven't already, by the Sierra Club that came out about a year ago, talking about and addressing that racist history.
Great, thank you. Right. Questions are flowing in directly to me and then in the group chat, but this is kind of a long one, so I will try to do my best. So you have a really interesting passage in the book about how communities of color were left out of the formation of the Earth Day movement, along with the history of the holiday dating back to the 70s. In a lot of ways, the systemic failure also feels directly tied the modern day greenwashing that refocuses Earth Month to capitalism and commodified resources. The question, how do you thoughtfully contend with this new wave of greenwashing marketing? And do you have suggestions or resources to help people authentically connect to the brands that seem eco-friendly on the surface, but are actually causing harm to the planet and marginalized communities? It's a lot.
A great question. And I think I can provide some nuance. So I worked at Patagonia headquarters for about 2 years before starting my nonprofit. And that was my first time. I actually worked in an eco-friendly soap company before that, but being able to work at this kind of utopia for conscious capitalism. And what I learned even while being there is, no company really needs to exist. So even if it's the most sustainable shirt in the world, we still have so many shirts that are out there, and there's still some sort of impact on the planet. So yeah, there's a lot to grapple with when it comes to conscious capitalism and consumerism. But working at Patagonia, I realized very quickly I couldn't afford most of the clothes without my 70% discount. And I was an employee of the company. So I started to also realize that there was this nuance between who could afford sustainable fashion and quote unquote sustainable items. And there's kind of a rhetoric in the sustainability space that you need to buy your way into sustainability. So the more wealth that you have, the more you have access to some of these brands that are ethical, etc. So again, I really try to meet people where they're at and not always shame people. If the most accessible thing to you is shopping at Target or CVS and finding the most sustainable brand that you can that's in your price point, even if their parent company maybe is not all the way there, but if that's what you can do that. And that can be a step in the right direction. I know it was for me. So I think just understanding that greenwashing is occurring in so many different ways from so many different companies, but just making the best decisions that you can make at that time, whether it's thrifting, if you do have access to purchase from sustainable and ethical brands, do that. If you have the time to really research a brand, read their sustainability report, etc., do that. If it's going to Target and CVS, like I said, and finding the best thing that you can, do that. If it's going to a refill shop, but I know those refills get expensive, do that. So just start wherever you can and then just gradually try to build on that. But there's really big accessibility concerns within the sustainability space. And I'm really hoping over time, sustainable manufacturing becomes the norm. So those prices can kind of level out and that these decisions can get a lot easier. But one thing to look out for with greenwashing is certifications. It's really hard to lie about those. So looking at things like 1% for the planet, B Corp, fair trade certification, organic certification, etc. And that can usually help you out.
Thank you. Yeah, that nuance is so important. You see that accessibility issue in so many things with even, food and and natural health products, everything. So thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so people are really kind of excited about your quest for environmental justice classes in colleges. So the next question is a follow-up on that as well from Dargan. He says, thank you for your efforts working to make sure college students learn about EJ. what kind of educational resources do you think need to be developed to
Mhm.
make sure all universities can teach EJ? And what are some resources that exist that students might not know about?
I feel like this would be a cool project to work on with someone, and I'm
Yeah.
trying to recruit as many people as possible. But I think something that I would like to do, I don't know what it looks like. I'm not too familiar with curriculums, but maybe that's something our nonprofit could work on in addition to the audit, is having some sort of recommended curriculum. That could be something that we release every couple of years that touches just on that, like your readings, your things you can talk about, articles. So if anyone wants to help, please let us know. But also, until those updates are there, there are so many classes that can basically create an intersectional environmentalist education, even if it's not called that. So for me, I remember taking my first sociology class, and there's so much of what I learned in this book. And then I also took a society in the environment class, and that's where I learned about ecofeminism. So I think it's important to understand, because sometimes right off the bat, just the course name, you might not know what exactly is being talked about. But if students could say, oh yeah, I learned about ecofeminism in this class, or there was a chapter on environmental justice, etc. So people can kind of design their own curriculums until intersectional environmentalism is really deeply infused. And then until then, I don't want to keep plugging intersectional environmentalists, but checking out some of our resources that we've created, from our documentaries to our podcasts, etc., and other kind of emerging educational digital media platforms that are making materials that educators can use in their classrooms to update. So those are just a few suggestions, but if anyone wants to help, send me an email at greengirlleah@gmail.com.
Love it. Thank you. Let's normalize asking for help and like not knowing all of the answers. I love that. Okay, so this is kind of a change in tack, a question about climate grief and anxiety. That's a lot of us. So how do you personally stay grounded and focused on your mission without burning out?
Yeah, and I want to be honest that I do. So I want people to know that I do burn out, and that's completely normal. But over time, it's gotten less and less. And I also have anxiety. So when you add eco anxiety, my brain is like, yes, this is perfect. But I also want to affirm to people that anxiety is a perfectly normal, or grief is a perfectly normal response to a world that seems like it's on fire. So the first thing, which is really similar to just having anxiety in general, is getting in touch with your feelings, because when you're not self-aware, you might act in ways, you might be more irritable, you might be angry, you might be crying, but you might not really be in touch with why. But I remember there was a day that I saw the ocean on fire about a year ago, and we're also in the pandemic, there's student loan debt, and I just didn't want to get out of bed. But it didn't register with me that I'm sad because I saw the ocean on fire, and I'm scared about our future. So taking time to journal about some of your feelings and acknowledge them and say, this is what I'm feeling, and just being really honest about that. And then moving into some of those coping skills and figuring out how you can move through that grief. But know that it's okay, and that grief isn't linear. Sometimes it'll exist as an undercurrent. But for me, I think the best solution to my eco anxiety and eco grief is leaning into radical imagination and climate optimism. So radical imagination is kind of the next phase of this book. Who knows, maybe I'll write another book one day. But first is learning about the systems that you want to dismantle, which I think is really important to understand what you want to change. But after that, spending the rest of your time on the beautiful world that you want to imagine for the future, and the steps that you can take to get to that place. And always rooting yourself in the solutions that are available. And we just came out with a podcast called The Joy Report, which is all about that. So people can also learn about the untold stories of the people who are making incredible solutions and trying to infuse our world with more joy. So climate optimism, radical imagination, get into it. It's a really good way to combat some of those feelings.
I'm gonna look into that. Thank you. Okay, I have another question here. And this goes back to something you said earlier about the balance of individual responsibility with the need for structural change. Oftentimes this means arguments about individual recycling practices, calling people out on that, or making sure we sign policies like the Paris Accord, big structural change. Can you talk a little bit more about how you view that balance?
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand. And there's, like you said, so many conversations of like individual action versus systems change, but individual actions lead to collective action, which leads to systems change. So it's really important to know that these aren't competing ideals in any way. So we should be encouraging both things. But I think understanding that there are systems that are problematic, like I think it's something like 70 corporations are I don't know, some like 100 corporations are causing 70% of emissions. Someone can fact check that. I don't know what the specific thing is, but it's important to go, wow, okay, there are systems that need to change that are leading to these problems. And I think that helps relieve some of the, oh, it's up to me to save the planet, because that's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. But you are a participant that can lead to systems change. So even things like consumer behavior, even though I don't like to talk about it that much, but consumer behavior adds up and it starts to lead to systems change. So even some of these fast fashion companies, they're really in tune with the data that Gen Z and millennials prefer brands that are made ethically and sustainably. So they're reshaping themselves in so many ways. And sometimes it feels a whole lot like greenwashing, but they're changing, and they have to, because people aren't supporting them in the same way. Even with other environmental organizations, they're reshaping their mission statements because they have to, because suddenly a bunch of environmentalists want to learn about environmental justice, etc. Curriculums, they're shifting because students are coming together, sometimes individually and then collectively, and saying, we want to learn about Hazel M. Johnson. Why is the mother of environmental justice not in our curriculum? And that's leading to systems change. So yeah, just really understanding that those ideals are not competing in any way. And it's individual change leads to collective change, leads to systems change. And those are all really, really important.
Thank you. Well, I had a question as a communicator that I wanted to ask you. So you call yourself an eco-communicator, which I'd never heard of before, which I love. It is a manifestation of that. And I was wondering how you approach your communications with an intersectional lens.
Yeah, I would say really always trying to meet people where they're at, like I was saying before, and it's imperfect. I don't always know exactly what to say. And if I don't know, I'll let people know that I don't know. And we can find somebody who does know, who can communicate about it a little bit better. But intersectional environmentalism is like 12 syllables. It's very long, and most people have no idea what that means. But I can say the same thing in different ways if need be. And that's not diluting the information, but if the goal as an environmentalist is to reach as many people as possible, this isn't about just gatekeeping the knowledge about the climate crisis within academic institutions. We want people who don't have access to academic institutions or aren't studying environmental science to be able to understand so they can be better stewards of the earth. And when you think about it that way, I think elitism just kind of goes out the window, and you can just think about it as a puzzle piece. Like, how can I meet people where they're at? So if there are people that are on TikTok right now, how can we talk about climate information on TikTok? If there are religious folks that are really interested in climate justice, how can we talk about the intersections of religion and spirituality with environmentalism? How can I phrase this in ways that different people can understand? And I think there's a beauty to that, and it's not diluting in any way. And that's something that, I really enjoy doing as a climate communicator. And I wanted to be a comms major, but ended up being an environmental science major. But I guess
Fascinating.
Came back to it.
Well, I actually majored in economics for some reason, and now I do communications, so I totally get that. All right, well, we had one more question from the RSVP process that I kind of saved toward the end. I was just waiting to see if anyone had any more questions for Leah while we're closing out our time here. And you feel free to also just raise your hand or turn on your video if you want to ask out loud. That's also okay. But I will share this question. It is, what gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope for the future? That's a good question. I think grassroots momentum gives me a lot of hope. There's systems and things that I thought would never change. Like, who would have thought the Sierra Club would release a statement about John Muir and his racist tendencies and things like that. So it gives me a lot of hope that we can constantly unlearn and relearn things, and systems can change. So yeah, that gives me a lot of hope about the future.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. I'm pretty comfortable with uncomfortable silences, so I'll wait just a minute. If anyone else has any questions for Leah, now's your time to ask. We're so grateful that you joined us today at the University of Washington on this 50-degree rainy day, which you can't see from my fake background here. And we are recording this for everyone, so we will share this out to folks who registered, and then also on our website and social media. And yeah, people are saying thank you so much.
Thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.
Thank you, Leah. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone.